clicking the button right now. All right, so it's going live, and then I'm going to go mute myself. Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone across the Zoom dome and around the world. You're welcome to the October 2022 edition of the African Literature Association Lecture Series. My name is Akin Adeshokan, and I teach comparative literature and African cinema at Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. And it's been my pleasure over the past 2 years to coordinate this series with my colleagues in the executive councils of the association, especially Matt Brown of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and James McCockle of William and Hobart College in Geneva, New York. The series began 2 years ago at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, forcing a global lockdown. But it was also an imaginative initiative suggested by the president of the association at the time, Grimai Negash of Ohio State University, and is that continued to receive the support of the Executive Council, particularly of subsequent presidents, Mohamed Kamara of Washington and Lee University, and Gaurav Desai of the University of Michigan, who is our current president and a co-organizer of the series. We also acknowledge the technical support of Dan Lellington, our web development assistant. In the main, the lecture series is meant to engage the members' intellectual and professional attention outside of the conference calendar, and it has had the benefit of opening literary studies up to other areas of the study of artistic expression, moving on to those fields in the humanities and the social sciences invested in the generation of knowledge in all spheres of life. We are getting there. Those in attendance who may be new to the series are encouraged to review past lectures dating back to September 2020, to get a sense of the diversity of subjects and scholars we already featured. As always, we acknowledge the continuing support of the other members of the council, as well as the larger membership of the association. Due to your continuing attention and attendance, the series has come to stand in the past 2 years, as a matter of fact, as a publicly engaged feature of the association's presence. In this age, when public engagement is roughly equivalent to being socially or civically responsive. Thank you, everyone. Today's event is a book presentation. Last year, as the world made a slow but uncertain and now ongoing recovery from the pandemic, something else appeared, indeed surfaced, but with a greater deal of certainty, an edited book of essays by South African women, titled appropriately, Surfacing. Our speakers today, Desiree Lewis and Gabeba Baderoon, are the co-editors of that volume. The book has a subtitle, an arresting one at that, On Being Black and Feminist in South Africa. It is not an idle move to compare the state of the world in 2021 to the publication of any book, because although Surfacing essentially gathers the creative and scholarly thoughts of individual authors, it imagines this gathering as within different distinct traditions, of which 4 are primary. That is, these include the work of Black feminist writers in the United States principally, the history of anthropological work carried out through the Daughters of Africa volumes by Margaret Busby, the cross-generational cultural and political conversations that have continued to sustain and nourish Southern African women writers and activists and their audiences. And finally, the curative products of those conversations within South Africa, a society where women face a specific routinized kind of violence on a daily basis. The individual authors are, like the editors, intimately familiar with these traditions, and for this reason, the volume promises to be generative and disposable to a great variety of practice. These statements are my own extrapolation as a reader of the volume, and our guests are better placed to speak to what motivated them to bring this book to the world, and I shall now yield the ground to them. Desiree Lewis is a professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. She writes on Black and post-colonial feminism and is the author of Living on a Horizon, Bessie Head and the Politics of Imagining. Her recent work on food expands the radical possibilities of post-colonial critiques of the Anthropocene. Gabeba Baderoon is the author of Regarding Muslims, From Slavery to Post-Apartheid, and the poetry collections, A Dream in the Next Body, 100 Silences, and the History of Intimacy. She's an associate professor of women's studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, and an African studies at Penn State University, where she co-directs the African Feminist Initiative. I'll now call on our speakers to take the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akin. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the ALA generally for this wonderful venture and also for inviting us. It's a great pleasure. As Akin has said, we have edited a book called Surfacing, a collection of Black feminist writing from South Africa. But our focus today is not so much the book itself and contributions to the book, but some of the neglected aspects in Black feminist thought, with particular reference, of course, to Surfacing. So we'll discuss Black feminist knowledge making in general. Gabeba and I generally are keen to raise discussion about areas of being, feeling, imagining, and yearning that tend to be neglected in much of the discussion of Black feminism, both in South Africa and beyond. Often readers and critics of Black feminism fixate on themes of suffering, experiences of injustice, and records of resisting acts. And obviously it goes without saying how important this is, but other questions tend to be neglected or ignored. The British feminist of color, Sarah Ahmed, reminds us that feminism is about how to live and a way of thinking about how to live. And I'm quoting her here. With the writings for Surfacing and the editing work on this, the aim was to concentrate not simply on what is done to Black women and how they resist, which could be described as reactive resistance knowledge production, but to envisage other possible worlds and ways of being. And this could be seen as a productive form of resistance. There's a post-colonial feminist, Kumkum Sangari, who I like very much. And she's referred to this in ways that I find really resonant. She talks about the politics of the possible. And I think that's really what Gabeba and I want to home in on today. I want to briefly hand over to Gabeba to say a few words on this.
Yes, indeed. I also echo the thanks to the ALA for this warm invitation and the opportunity to talk about this book, which is something I very much cherish having worked on. As Desiree says, when space is made for knowledge by Black women, it's often assumed to deal with a limited area of suffering or deficit. And at the same time, there's the assumption not only of a narrow thematic range, but that such knowledge will appeal to a very narrow audience, usually other Black women. And in contrast, we were both moved by the way that knowledge that is produced by Black women, and especially Black feminists, in fact holds a very ambitious appeal. It speaks to a universal desire for radically reimagining the world and envisioning a liberated future. What we loved about the essays in Surfacing is that their varied themes and forms were the practices of a liberated imagination. They were a succession of answers to the question, what does it mean to be able to imagine and live freedom? Over to you, Desiree.
Thanks, Gabeba. As Gabeba implies, the ideas we want to discuss are kind of deemed esoteric. They're the sort of ideas that are raised very often in philosophy, religion, or ethics, but they're usually dismissed in our very rationalist, post-Enlightenment political philosophy. And this is despite the inroads made by decolonial thought, which tries to dismantle the dualisms that separate certain kinds of thinking. So yeah, we really want to think about how these dualisms have worked quite destructively. So we're separating our lecture, which we've rather pretentiously called a dialogic lecture, into a discussion of themes, which are obviously connected, but which we are separating for the sake of just focusing. We'll also go on to refer to various chapters and writers in the book Surfacing connected to each theme. Just to anticipate, the themes that we're going to talk about are love, which has received renewed attention. I think many people know this since the death of Bell Hooks, who was passionate about connecting a love ethic to political struggle, to feminist political struggle. We're also focusing on compassion. We're focusing on the themes of pleasure and the erotic, and joy, and lastly, spirituality. So I'll kick off with talking a bit about love, bearing in mind that, of course, it's connected to other themes and concerns. I mentioned Bell Hooks, and I think she looms very large in Black feminist discussions of the centrality of love. Her love ethic and the focus of love also of other feminists involves seeing love as a vital component of resistance and states of true freedom. Now, I think a facile way of thinking about this is to see expressing love as completely antithetical to feeling anger or rage, the spirit that makes one fight back in the face of oppression. This is sometimes assumed about philosophies like Hooks and others, and is actually implied in certain other philosophies. But love, as conceptualized by many feminists, isn't a fuzzy, nice feeling we have when we expel all negative feelings like hurt, pain, anguish, or anger. In fact, this neat separation of love and anger is a product of the dualistic system that many other feminist philosophies resist. A much quoted phrase of another Black feminist thinker, Audre Lorde, especially in her "Your silence will not protect you," springs to mind here. Lorde refers to many things with this phrase, but one meaning is that making that great refusal to be complicit with one's oppression is integral to an ethic of love in the form of self-love. This involves surfacing, cognitively, viscerally, and psychologically, a political response and declaring in one way or another, I am angry because I matter. Black women are often pathologized for expressing anger, and many of us are all too familiar with being told that we need to get over our anger issues. This pathologizing fails to realize that anger is often not some individualized feeling that one needs to manage through psychological effort. Also important here is how anger is vitally connected to desire, to imagining, to hope, to the possibility of some other world. Pat McFadden has spoken about this wonderfully in much of her writing, especially in her essay in this volume, Surfacing. The other two writers in the book Surfacing that I think of in relation to this are Grace Musila and Danai Mupotsa. And I'm not going to quote from them, but I really am urging people to actually get the book and look at the essays look at the actual essays. Let me just say something about these two writers. Grace Musila's essay, My Two Husbands, explores the idea of self-loss and the patriarchal scripting of women's prescribed roles as men's appendages. Pain and anger echo in descriptions that are often funny, but also very incisive about men's and women's complicity in getting a young Black woman to behave as a woman should. At the same time, Musila triumphantly celebrates an agential self, which is vitally connected to, but not dominated by, the contradictory and troubling influences in her life. Danai Mupotsa's essay, also in Surfacing, especially because of its poetic and generically hybrid form, also testifies to a recovered and discovered I. And it's interesting that Danai, many years ago, wrote a very powerful essay called This Little Rage of Poetry, which people should really look up. Obviously claiming the right and need to express rage, but also, as in a surfacing essay, positioning rage not as the binary opposite of self-love, but as something that's enmeshed with it. I believe many other young Black women poets today, and I've been kind of paying attention to this vacillating of tone and subject matter back and forth. Many young Black women poets, performance artists are emphatic about interweaving a range of seemingly conflicting emotions of anger, sadness, and joy simultaneously, not in the linear progressive way that therapeutic discourses prescribe our need to progress somehow from anger towards self-love and healing, as though this was some kind of neat transition. Today, self-love among women, especially Black women, is commercialized in a body perfection and self-improvement industry that tells women that physical and psychological self-improvement, according to prescribed standards, is conditional on consuming products and services. Of course, this actually feeds off and reproduces women's self-hatred. It also promotes a frighteningly individualist ethic. Critiques of individualism are central to many Black feminists' endorsing of love, especially in their foregrounding awareness of and care for others. Many affirm the need for connectedness and empathy among human beings, and also with what has been called the more than human nature and animals. And let me hand over here to Gabeba.
Yes, our next theme is on compassion, and you may wonder about the proportion of talking today, and it's actually an act of compassion. I'm recovering from COVID, and Desiree is very generously doing much of the talking, so thank you for that, Desiree. Compassion means to feel with, even to suffer with, to be near, to stand alongside, next to, and to choose to share what the other is feeling. And close to compassion is the sense of empathy, which is an ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And compassion is one of those themes that runs entirely through the collection Surfacing. And from the very beginning, we, of course, I think, write a very interesting and vigorously argued introduction that I hope will also draw your attention. But for the very first essay by Sisonke Msimang is about the exact feeling of empathy that drives Msimang's biography of Winnie Madikizela Mandela. And the reason for this is that Msimang learns herself in a very direct way what it is like to be lied about and to have one's name shaped by men, some women, but by men's interests and power. And when she herself is lied about and her integrity is at the mercy of men's decisions in this way, she learns empathy. She learns empathy with a childhood friend whose name had similarly been deeply impugned by stories that had been told about her. And from this, she learns later, as the biographer of Winnie Mandela, that writing about this figure, this iconic woman, required generosity and care, she says. And this is a quotation from her essay. I was acutely aware that part of my task was to address the public vitriol to which Winnie Mandela had been subjected during her life and in the immediate aftermath of her death. In response, I adopted a deliberate and contrarian posture of admiration in my writing. This posture was not mere gesture. I certainly do admire her accomplishments. Still, the overall stance was a political signal designed to put across the message that the work of recovering Winnie's story required generosity and care. It required that her biographer acknowledge and respect her humanity. So I think laying the ground there for the political work that compassion does is something that is taken up through the rest of surfacing. And I'll just point you to other instances in which this happens. Phumla Xolo, who is one of the best known feminist writers in South Africa, contributes a piece here that she calls a playful but very serious letter to Gabrielle Goliath, the artist. And here, Xolo explains what it is like to be a person in her body who stands in front of the artwork of Goliath and feels the empathy, feels the compassion, the next-to-ness that Goliath's artwork invites in her audience, and Xolo conveys what this means to have one's body entered into by an artwork, and then to feel and understand its work through that compassionate posture. So it's a really beautifully written essay about what it means to feel physically. And this is one of the features of this collection as well. It's really evocative writing. I know it is easy for editors to say this, but really as a reader of this book as well, it has been a perpetual pleasure, because it is writing that is intellectually rich, but not distant and not static and not full of a heavy authority, but instead is extremely evocative and pleasurable to read. I also want to point you to Panache Chigumatsi's essay on hearing silences. You're hearing my old kitty in the background, who's a little bit ill, so forgive that. Panache Chigumatsi, who speaks about what it is like to actually perceive what is hidden within silences. And in order to hear that, one needs an extremely close an adjacency and a next-to-ness to the silence of the person which you are reading. And so that also is a very beautiful essay. And lastly, two essays that I will speak about more under the category of spirituality as well, by Yvette Abrams and Patricia McFadden, which actually are the climax of the book. Here, they both, who are both intellectuals and gardeners and farmers, they practice a radical compassion and love for themselves, for their neighbors, and a compassion with the earth, a feeling with the earth. And again, these are, I think, embodiments of what the book defines as compassion. Thanks, Desiree, back to you.
Thanks, Gabeba. I'm going to move on now, bearing in mind that these themes are so connected to the theme of, I sound like a sort of someone telling students how to extrapolate themes, but to the area of pleasure and the erotic. Yeah, just to start off by saying that sexuality, pleasure, and the erotic have been framed in hegemonic discourses that encourage us to fixate on atomized feelings, to reduce them to one bodily, psychic, or cognitive experience. One of the most powerful interventions into this limiting understanding is, and I've quoted her before, I mentioned it before, is Audre Lorde's. And Audre Lorde describes the power of the erotic in the following way, and I'm quoting her here. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply spiritual plane. The superficially erotic has been encouraged as a sign of female inferiority. At the same time, we have come to distrust the power which rises from our deepest and non-rational knowledge. Lorde does not set out to describe the suppressed power in the way that, for example, medical or psychology discourses would, but she suggests that the erotic as integral to a kind of broader ethic of love, can't be reduced to what she calls a sensation in itself, or what she calls the superficially erotic. In fact, it's distorted when we subject it to the obsessive categorizing that Western-centric and patriarchal logic loves. It's worth stressing that sex and sexuality through patriarchy and through disciplines like biology, psychology, medicine, and anatomy have been codified in very constraining ways. And the covert disciplining of sex and sexuality has had particularly damaging effects for Black women. Dominant knowledge systems reduce the erotic to specific bodily feelings, particular aspects of the anatomy, what gendered bodies do or should not do, the objectifying of certain raced and gendered bodies, and often ridiculously clinical ideas about pleasure. Sexuality and the erotic have also been disciplined repressively by deep violence, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia. The calling out of both the repressive and covert disciplining of sexuality is especially evident in essays by Fosi Gaba and Zetu Matabeni in the book Surfacing. Both refer to patriarchal and homophobic worlds that imprison women's sexual experiences in shame, guilt, the deprivation of agency, and violent objectification. Both also criticize discourses that limit women's sexual autonomy and choices. At the same time, both triumphantly outline personal and political and very productive, that goes without saying, responses. And I just want to read an extract here from Zetu Matabeni's essay, which illustrates this. And I won't contextualize it because I think the extract speaks for itself. Each day you yearn to come back to yourself, yet fragments remain. Within the walls you build, you recollect yourself piece by piece. There is no completeness in ruins. You will own yourself. Reclaiming yourself is a difficult task. You did not lose yourself. Something was taken from you, a part of you, even though the one who stole from you can never replace anything. The recognition of theft is an important starting point. How do you explain this theft, which is also an invasion and forceful inhabiting of another's body? Yes, he left parts of himself on you, and you refuse to carry them any longer. Now you are finding your own way of dealing with things. Just turning to another writer here, Fosi Gaba, in an essay which is wonderfully titled The Music of My Orgasm, references her own discovery of empowering sexuality by linking the expansive ideas about sexual pleasure to political freedom in a way that's very reminiscent of Lord. In fact, she does acknowledge Lord. And I want to quote her here as well. Okay. Let me start here. The physiological release of masturbation had its benefits, but in time, the significance of this retreated to the background. It was the existential gifts I received, control being the most important. That I valued the most. As a teenager, I learned the truth of Lord's words long before I came across the word feminism, long before I came across her writings. I began using the gifts of masturbation when making decisions about many things in my life, and this became a pattern of my life. Today, I can say, and this is when a cliche is welcome, without any fear of contradiction, that masturbation was foundational to my feminism. Yeah, so I want to move on now before Gabeba takes over to another connected theme, which is the theme of joy. Like love, joy and happiness are compartmentalized in ways that make these seem to be antithetical to reason, cognitive understanding, and the workings of the mind. We are taught, often by very well-meaning teachers, of course, parents or mentors who care, that joy is somehow indulgent and frivolous. And I'm reminded here of Alice Walker's novel focusing on FGM, which is called Possessing the Secret of Joy. The central character who experiences FGM feels deep outrage. In the name of healing, she's also subject to the therapeutic practices mobilized by psychiatry and psychology in the name of women's mental health. Alienated by all of this, she ultimately finds answers for herself and cultivates her personal sense of well-being when she speaks out against violence against women, both for herself and for others. Like many other writings referred to earlier and writings in surfacing, Walker's novel refuses to compartmentalize feelings as though they were clinically measurable symptoms that medical experts could methodically fix. Instead, she makes it clear that Tashi, the protagonist, is capable of finding and defining her own joy and on her own terms. Many Black women are taught to be very anxious about joy. Joy is something we tend to deny ourselves because the world we inhabit tells us, basically, that we are undeserving of it. The numerous misogynistic and racist images, stories, adverts, novels, museum exhibits, newspaper articles and photos, classical paintings, historical texts, forms of medical knowledge, and much else. And I'm not talking about the past, I'm talking about today, that shape our discursive. These all shape our discursive world. And obviously we are taught to resist this by some and make every effort to do so. But these also engulf our imaginative universe and the resources we have to define a positive sense of self. To speak back to this violent legacy demands that we become what Sarah Ahmed calls the feminist killjoy. In other words, the destroyer of what gives dominant groups their satisfaction and joy, but what in the process of outraging others, inconveniencing others, unsettling others, means creating our own freedom and self-confidence. It's worth reminding ourselves that stereotypes are controlling images. The stereotype of Black women's bodies defines them in rigid, essentialist ways, with reference to lack, aberration, for example, hypersexuality, or use value only. To be able to derive joy from the body's surface is to refuse the power of those who've had the power to control and name subordinate groups' bodies. I'm fascinated by how this is explored in really intricate ways. I mean, I've kind of summarized it quite bluntly, analyzed it quite bluntly, but how this is unraveled by many of the writers in surfacing, but maybe especially by an essay by Jackie Job and Pumla Bola, and Gabeba's already mentioned Bola, but I want to say a bit more about her. Let me turn to Jackie Job first, who's a dancer and a writer. And I won't again contextualize this piece, but she says it all in her description of an evening that follows one of her dance performances. Once, as I was leaving the theater after a performance, two people stopped me and said the most surprising and encouraging things. After performing an unconventional dance where I was focused on creating a sense of vulnerability and abstract lines of my movements, one woman was so happy that I could walk. Watching me on stage, she believed I was disabled, an observation which hugely upset a partner who saw me as a butterfly. That was when I realized that I could move beyond my skin and body, beyond hotnot, gangster, wannabe, or the brutal mistake of some boss's libidinous rights, essentially rape and pillage. I could be naked or wear flimsy clothes, not to provoke, but to feel the air move across and around my chest and thighs, heavy and thick at one moment, and light wisps the next. Ola, as she often does in her prolific of directly refers to the violence inflicted on black men's bodies and embedded in their psyches. At the same time, in what she calls a playful but serious love letter, the reader is able to follow her intricate and also uneven, deliberately so, process of discovering some sense of joy. And this occurs within a community of women, including the implied reader, the addressee of a letter, because the essay takes the form of a letter, other writers, artists. So that Gola, in similar ways to Alice Walker, gestures towards the enormous courage and will required to be as a resisting, acting, desiring agent in the wake of extreme misogynistic violence. This agency also includes speaking about tangled emotions. Our vocabulary for emotions, as they were clearly either one thing or another, is actually extremely limited and often fails us with this, effort to really capture how tangled they inevitably are. Gola also avoids sequencing feelings and states, as though release and healing necessarily follow and neatly follow trauma and pain. Sometimes they get jumbled up, she shows, and that's how it should be. That's how it inevitably is. She also shows that they complicatedly involve the visceral, the cognitive, feeling, and thought, the body responding at the same time as the mind. Sarah Ahmed is quite insightful in explaining this when she focuses on what she calls the cultural politics of the emotion, raising a challenge for us to decipher the emotions as carefully as we do with thoughts, words, text, writing. In a world that privileges reason, thought, and the mind, she asks, how do we read the emotions? How do we talk about the emotions, given the limits of language? How do we take them seriously as forms of knowing and as sources of knowledge? And I'm going to hand over to Gabeba now.
Thank you. I just want to draw your attention to the cover of the book to see what for me is an embodiment of that collectivity that Desiree referred to in Gola's essay, just that the co-presence of all of these figures simultaneously making up the book together is, I think, a beautiful rendition of that insight Desiree just shared. I was very intrigued by, long before I co-edited this book with Desiree, I have been inspired by and really as an intellectual challenged by the kind of writing on spirituality that has happened in South Africa for decades now. And so in writing, in collecting and curating a book on Black feminist writing in South Africa, it was absolutely necessary for us to seek out essays that address this, but also to see how they appeared even in essays that we didn't assume would contain reference to spirituality. And the very brilliant choreographer and dancer, Jackie Jo, whom Desiree has referred to, is also a writer on spirituality and what it means to be a young Christian woman, finding a new relation to her body and to her practice of art. The writer Gertrude Fester Wickham as well, in recounting her own political history of anti-apartheid resistance and her relation with Richard Reeve and Sally Gross, also speaks about spirituality, and spirituality not in a separate realm, but as integrally present in that same life narrative about anti-apartheid resistance. And I'll read to you from Fester Wickham. I was enrolled at St. John's School next to the church. Every Friday at school, we had to go to Holy Mass on the other side. We had to go to Holy Mass. On the other side was the whites-only Holy Cross Convent. There we were every Friday, sitting across from one another in church, us on the right side and them on the left. They did not look at us, nor we at them. There was an unspoken antagonism between us. We were also a bit of a motley bunch. Some of us did not have uniforms, others were barefoot. We felt so inferior to them, all neat and smart with Panama hats. We were in the church of a God who symbolized equal love for all, yet there was polarization and hostility between the two groups of Jesus's children. The contradictions puzzled me. Was this Christianity in practice? She writes. Also, alluding to the great contribution that South African scholars and thinkers have made to Islamic feminism, are two quite riveting writers whom I admire enormously, Sadia Sheikh and Fatima Sidat, both writing about the gender of divinity. And this is Fatima Sidat on, again, the way in which spirituality is in fact not separate from feminist activism, feminist reflection and theory. And she points out that an understandable Western anxiety about religion, which has emerged from the ways in which religion has placed and excluded women from public sphere, has led to a hesitance about religion within feminist work. And she says there are consequences for not engaging as feminists with spirituality. And she shows us one of these consequences in an account of a protest march in 2018. She describes an independent group of feminist activists, that is, not feminist activists connected with political parties, who called for a hashtag total shutdown march to protest violence against women, and describes a particular march in Cape Town, which she attended, and where the women had specified that men should not attend. So this was a march solely for women and people who identified as women. And a friend of hers at that march remarked to Sidat that a male-free space provided a sense of security for those in the march. Eventually, the enormous crowd of people reach their goal, which is the gates of Parliament. And then the following quotation. We had finally reached the gates of Parliament, where the formalities began. To our surprise, a Christian cleric began the proceedings, and I will leave it to you to imagine the outrage when the first words from the woman's officiant were, "In the name of God the Father." So here then is a feminist struggle to imagine a God, a divinity that was not male, even at a protest march for women and women identifying people only, at which men had been asked to stay away. And Sidat continues, I listened in as another marcher asked why she could not speak of God the Mother. In the officiant's failure to respond adequately, my sister marcher shared her view that clerics are brainwashed such that the possibilities of a female God evade them. There was another prayer by a Muslim woman volunteer from the crowd. While there was no mention of God the Father in her prayer, there was also no special attention to the alternative gendered possibilities of the divine, despite the increasing feminist readings of religion. And so I think here that, as Sidat says, we make intentional demands to exclude men, but can we not ask a male God to stay away as well, so that we could include an idea of divinity that spoke directly to the concerns of women marching against domestic violence? So here then is the radicality of the way in which spirituality is drawn into Black feminist thought in these two instances. And there are others in which this happens as well across the collection, because in fact, in no case was it the case that we had excluded the spiritual. As I mentioned, I'm going to end with Yvette Abrams and Patricia McFadden, because it is there that I think that the integration of spirituality and feminism really a climactic note to the entire collection surfacing. And this is what Abrams says. Sometimes in areas, and this is she's speaking about her garden and her farm, sometimes in areas which have been worked intensely, I can walk and feel the ground spring under my feet, touching the thick duff slowly created. Then I know what it is like to walk like a free person. A deep ancestral feeling in the soles of my feet lets me know I have achieved something worthwhile with my life. To restore 1 hectare of land to its decolonized state is the highest life purpose I can imagine. Centimeter by centimeter, my body begins to feel decolonized. Brain cell by brain cell, I begin to appreciate just how deeply I have been colonized. But, she says, I learn to walk like a truly free person. It just comes home to me what that means to work in a spiritual connection with the earth, and then the way this translates through the body up to the sense of being. And in Pat McFadden's essay, which is the last essay of the collection, McFadden describes her conscious choice to be a vegan as an African woman, and to live as an ecological feminist and a herbal healer, as a means of locating herself in a revolutionary landscape wherein, I quote, I can reconfigure the core feminist principles of bodily, sexual, and spiritual integrity. Wellness and wholeness, a radical location, enables me to use the distance I have created between myself and what she calls gendered nationalists, to scrutinize and interrogate their collusive tactics and strategies, as well as to craft new imaginaries of feminist freedom. So for McFadden, taking a step back from the instrumentality of some forms of feminism, and instead to craft something that is ecological and spiritual and bodily at the same time. And she goes on to describe an exchange with a neighbor of hers, which I find one of the most moving passages in the entire book, in which it is possible for two women separated by class, educational background, life practices, to find a connection with one another, which is not one way. It's not that McFadden teaches this woman how to garden and harvest her own food, but it is actually very mutual. And that this idea of creating a community and a harvest and a bounty is something that emerges as a model of a new feminist practice, which I think is attains a spiritual level in both McFadden and Abrams's writings. So I hope that this has conveyed to you some of the richness of the work that Desiree and I were fortunate enough to co-edit. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you. This is wonderful, and quite grateful to both of you for this extremely generous that's another theme that you possibly could have included in those list of things about really speaking to us about this book, but also actually focusing on your contributors in very, very generous and inclusive and very enriching ways. So thank you very much. I enjoyed every second of it, and I wish you could go on for much longer. But as I said, this is enough attentiveness on your part. So thank you very much. As always, we try to take questions from the audience, and as they come in, we share them and you respond to them. I so far haven't seen anything, but I was ready. Well, let me say I was hopeful that at least there will be any, but since we haven't had any so far, I was thinking through a number of questions, and I thought I would just pose one, if I may, to both of you quite generally. And it's about the it's something that actually began to occur to me as I listened to you, which really was the way you innovatively approach the discussion of the book itself in terms of these themes of love, compassion, pleasure, joy, spirituality, and the erotic, and which you actually, as I said, very innovative rather than recapping the book itself. At the same time, however, as you know, this is an edited book, and with a lot of very different but extremely compelling and ultimately compatible perspectives. I'm just interested in you really telling our audience about how this book actually came about, how it came together, in fact, because it's an edited book, and the conception and production of the book are not always the same. So I'm personally interested in that, and I think that the people might be interested as well. So if you can just say something about that. I have a follow-up question. I thought I would at least ask that to set this going. So thank you.
I think I'll start because I was present at the meeting, I think, where the idea for the book was first conveyed, and this was by Roshan Kader, who herself is a Black feminist editor who works with Wits University Press. And I must say to Wits University Press, happy 100th birthday. They are celebrating their centenary this year. And, you know, for those of us, especially based in universities in the global South and in the global North, the place of African publishers is, I think, a very important one to address. And I think that an innovative collection like this, finding its home at Wits University Press, is an indication of the richness of such a location. But to say more, Roshan Kader herself, a Black feminist commissioning editor who works for Wits Press, came to me in 2017 and spoke about the fact that there was no such collection in South Africa. And it's really telling that there is not, given the wealth of writing. It wasn't even the case that since 1994, there had been a collection of feminist writing generally in South Africa that had been published. So in this face of this absence, she began to speak with me about what such a book might look like. And it is, of course, at that point that I thought of working with Desiree, because I think I say this often in places where Desiree is not present, so I hope she doesn't feel embarrassed, but she really, since the 1990s, when I first, even actually before I met her, when I first heard about her work, she has been an inspiration to me. And I think she is a leading feminist scholar in South Africa, and it just made absolute sense to try to work with her. I was so grateful that she agreed. And then perhaps, Des, you might want to say a little bit about how the rest of it went, the putting together of the book.
I think also, you know, the moment of the conceptualizing conceptualizing of the book was an interesting one, because this was at the height of Fees Must Fall. It was at a time when there was a very strong interest and awareness of this thing, this creature called Black feminist thought. So, I think that there was a receptiveness among publishers and newspaper editors and so on to somehow cover it. So it was a convenient time. I think the truth of the matter is that Black feminist academics in South Africa have been kind of thinking about these things for a long time. Ola probably has, Yvette Abrams has, Gabeba, you have. So it was not so much that moment. I think, that the idea came up, but I think it was more that it was an opportune time. It was a time when publishers like the publisher at Wits University Press were obviously receptive, because there are certain sensibilities that they had. Certain things were able to come together in ways that they couldn't come together before. So I think that was really an important thing. In terms of the actual production of the book, it took a long time. I think one of the things that we were acutely aware of was that, a lot of the publishing of Black women's writing has focused on fiction rather than on non-fictional work, rather than what is conventionally understood to be interpretation, knowledge production. And we wanted to kind of somehow break the assumption that if you write autobiographically or creatively, you are producing something that's fictional, that someone else interprets. We wanted to really stress the importance of the work that people were writing as forms of knowledge making. And I think for many people it was a challenge, because we live in a world where you either write in an academic way or else you write sort of autobiographically. So the personal essay, I think, is a wonderful form. The essay generally, I think, is a wonderful form. It's much more wonderful than what's called the academic article, which is really usually extremely boring. So I think people really poured their hearts and souls into these personal essays. And I think this is why the complexity around thinking about, for example, the way that joy or pleasure is often connected to thinking through what violence is all about. I think this is why this complexity surfaced so well, is because people were really kind of, it's not as if they were told to please write an essay on violence. They were asked to please write an essay which somehow speaks to your thinking, your experience and your thinking as a Black feminist living in South Africa. So I'll pause there because it's a long question and requires a long answer. But Gabeba, I don't know if you want to take it up, or Akin, if you want to take it in another direction.
Can I add something just to the very last sentence that you said about Black feminists living in South Africa? One of the features of the book that I'm most proud of and excited by is exactly how we defined what it means to be Black and feminist in South Africa. I think some people will say, well, I think you've got certain errors in the contents list of your collection, because there are people from Eswatini, people from Kenya, people from Zimbabwe. What do you mean Black and feminist in South Africa? And in fact, the same liberated imagination that Desiree is describing in relation to the form of the book is also present in how we decided what constituted South African. And it was not on the basis of passport. It was not on the basis of official border crossing, but it is on the basis of participation and contribution. It would be inconceivable to have this collection without the presence of Grace Musila or Danai Mupotsa, or Panashi Chigumatsi, or Patricia McFadden in the way that we envision the book, simply because they do not have South African passports. So I think if the book redefines belonging beyond a nationalist frame, I think that is a wonderful contribution that it makes. And I think it also is a reflection of the complexity and the layering of feminist debates in South Africa, which do not observe these nationalist boundaries. So,
oh, thank you. Well, there's a question in the chat, but before I get to that, I want to basically follow up on the answer you just offered. Thank you very much, Habiba. And this is about the subtitle of the book. It's on being Black and feminist in South Africa. So I'm just trying to see how I can hear that. Is it the and this is again not just for my information, but for the information of the general audience, those who may not have read the book. Is it about being Black and feminist, or being Black and feminist? Do you understand that? I mean, that, in other words, if you are not Black or a feminist, you can be heard, or you have to be both Black and feminist to be heard here.
Yeah, this is a complex question in a multitude of ways. First of all, what is Black? What is Black in South Africa? Definitely, we were interested in the simultaneity of being Black and feminist. We addressed the issue of this category of Blackness in South Africa, following the Black consciousness definition and following Stuart Hall's notion of identification rather than a static identity. And the Black consciousness definition of Blackness in South Africa refused the distinctions that apartheid obsessively made, which were fictional distinctions anyway, but between different kinds of Blackness. And it created this concept as a political concept, as a chosen identity. And it is that to which we look, with at the same time an acknowledgement that the debate around race and identification in South Africa is in itself in flux. And there are many younger feminists, for instance, who participated in the protests that Desiree was referring to, the Fees Must Fall protests and the feminist protests around that, who actually look at race differently and who assert and claim some of those terms that we did not use in the book, but as also part of their feminist projects. So the book at the same time, because it's the first one ever of Black feminist writing, and it's the first gathering of feminist writing since for a long time, it has a certain, I think, maybe a status as a first, and therefore there's the question of who was included and who was not included. And for us as editors, this was a really difficult element of our work. Already, we motivated for doubling actually of the size of this collection. And we really had to work hard to make that happen within the constraints that we faced with WITS as well in terms of production costs. But even so, not everybody who is needs to be in a book like this is present. And legitimately, we have faced real questions. Why am I not in here? Why have I not been invited? There's a hurt about not being part of this conversation. And I think the only answer that we have been able to give is that let's have more. It is impossible to be a final word on a topic as bracing, as large, as necessarily layered as knowledge production by Black feminists in South Africa. So Des, I don't know if you wanted to add to that as well.
No, not really. I think just to reinforce what you've said, that there's been such a huge gap, that to address that gap and believe that one is, fully addressing the gap would be outrageous. It's part of a process, a broader process of confronting the silences, the exclusions that have gone on for decades and that are continuing.
Especially in this genre, as Desiree pointed out earlier on, the genre of theory making, the genre of philosophy, the genre of this particular kind of nonfiction writing, which has generally not been seen as the realm of Black women. And that's quite astonishing, to go into a bookshop and just notice the absences and notice the presences. So I hope that this will, not only the existence of this book, but it's the way it is being discussed and the way it is being taught from what we are told by colleagues and students. Hopefully this will motivate more publication in this arena by Black women. It certainly is necessary.
Yeah, maybe I could just connect what you're saying, what's being said now, to the question that was asked, why were men not invited? I mean, as Gabeba is saying, and as I very strongly believe, there is a preponderance, an absolute dominance of men in scholarship about what it means to be African, what it means to be Black. This collection is deliberately titled On Being Black and Feminist. And the argument is that there's a very particular perspective about being positioned as a woman in the existing power system. And this perspective, this vantage point, has not been fully taken into account. As we were saying, I mean, there are so many African women scholars, Patricia McFadden, Amina Mama, who have produced amazing philosophical work that has philosophical and epistemological implications. But if you look for a book on African philosophy, you will not find their name. So it was really important to foreground the voices of women who are speaking not as essentialized women, but speaking from a particular vantage point, because those vantage points are excluded.
I agree. And, one might say, well, why are you complaining about not being present in philosophy? You're present very much in autobiography. Why you're in poetry, you're in fiction. What is the purpose of claiming a space also in these authoritative genres of deliberating on the nature of the present and what the future might be? And I think we have found, when looking at that range of publications, that when women are not present in the definition of freedom, in the definition of what might be a transformed future, then that future and that definition of freedom will lack us. And that is clear in, for instance, the way in which the post-apartheid nation was defined, so that without the full presence of women, the national space has been a harmful space for women. So we must be present in defining the meaning of freedom. We must be present in defining the meaning of the present and the future, and certainly also of the past. I mean, in other words, it's just very crucial intellectually and historically and politically that women are present in this kind of writing and knowledge making.
Okay, well, thank you. There's actually, as I said, a question in the chat, and I think it's deliberately directed towards Gabeba, Dr. Baderoon, knowing that there are many men who share the interests of women how more rewarding will it be if the revolting women had permitted male allies and supportive male gods to join them? I think this was in reference to the piece by Sida, I believe, that you read. So, Grant.
Yes, the overwhelming majority of protests include both genders and all genders. This was a particular instance of protest which women elected should be for women only. And the challenge that you identify, Balumi Fulajimi, is that indeed the feminists who spoke at the march failed because they were not able to imagine a divinity that was not male in a place that was deliberately intended to be women only and women identified people only. So it was a challenge to feminists, but it is also an indication of the value of singular spaces. Sometimes we do things with just women, and sometimes we do things where we invite all genders. You might very well have said to us, why are there not white women in your book? But the purpose of this particular gathering was precisely to draw attention to the work of Black women and to define that in the way that we did. You know, there might also have been critiques of the way we defined who is to be included in that. So already it is undertaking an important and complicated task. And we have decided it is a task that is valuable enough to devote a book to. I think in that march, there was also the decision, it is valuable enough for women to undertake protest against the national neglect. That is the reason the march was to Parliament. The national neglect of the epidemic phenomenon of violence against women. And why is this not a national issue? They were asking, and it was bodies of women who wanted to make that march and make that petition. And why not, in that case, ask the supportive male gods, like the supportive male allies, to stand aside for that one moment? I think allies can do that, and in the next march to join.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let me pose this question, which some kind of, I mean, you touched upon it when you were giving your individual or your specific responses during the presentation, and it was something that also occurred to me as I was, especially the introduction, and I think I made a passing mention to it in my introduction, though I didn't quite place it in context, which is this, that there is an awareness or a foregrounding of a certain tradition of Black feminist writing, especially from the United States, in the introduction, and actually in terms of the very motivation for the work as some kind of ancestral awareness that, if you want, was present as you worked on this book. But I'm just wondering how to think of this tradition in relation to the kind of work that's done in South Africa, especially on this book. So this is the way I want to put this, just a question to think with. There's already, and you mentioned this, some of your contributors, Msimang's biography of Winnie Mandela, Grace Mosila's biography of Amathai Wangari. So these are attempts by Black women in South Africa to actually write stories or tell stories about other Black women who are figures, important historical figures. But I'm just interested in how much traction this is gaining and how you envision this book to advance that in terms of actually getting or generating very solid historical, theoretical, political material that will sort of align with your premise, which is that this is about thoughts rather than reactive thought, but actually attempts to actually put forward ideas by African women. So I think I'm just interested in how you envision this book to contribute to that. These are specific contributions by writers, limited by space, limited by the context of the production of the book itself. Together, they come across as a particular argument, but how do you envision that to be a contribution to what's been going on with these very discrete attempts to tell stories of African women?
Yeah, I think I'll have to go and start off with a response. I mean, I'm interested in your use of the word traction. What kind of traction does this sort of work have? And the truth of the matter is far less of an impact than a lot of the work that is being produced in the US. And it's not, it's because of the global knowledge economy and the fact that the assumption is that what comes from the North, and even bearing in mind that Black feminists in the North are marginalized in relation to white writers or white women writers. What comes from the North is considered to be definitive. So we find that even today, in African contexts, young Black scholars on the continent are being given as sources of serious, definitive theoretical work, bell hooks or Delors only. I'm not saying, of course, that these should be excluded, but we did hope, and we raised this in the introduction, that this is a problem, and this kind of skewing and this kind of, absolute kind of celebration, affirmation of what comes from the US is seriously problematic. And again, it's not simply a matter of certain bodies being included or certain bodies being excluded. It's the fact of the matter is the knowledge is different. Knowledge produced in particular contexts comes from a certain vantage point. It's informed by certain experiences, political experiences, and therefore has a lot to offer in terms of understanding and unraveling power. So we are hoping, it's not so much what we envisage, what we think will happen. We hope that this will be part of an intervention in the same way that there have been other interventions made by, for example, certain, just one example is the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town, who launched a journal called Feminist Africa, which was an attempt to insist on the centrality of African feminist knowledge. So it's not as if this is the only effort to make that intervention into Northern dominance, even when it comes to post-colonial Black feminist knowledge. But this is part of the attempt to shift that. Habiba, I'm not sure if you'd like to.
You want to add anything, Habiba?
Yes, I expect and hope for more discussion on precisely that point, Desiree. We say in our introduction that it has sadly been the case that South African Black women feature really often as the raw material for debates and theorizations by scholars in the North, including Black feminist scholars, and that the politics of citation, which is something that people attend to very much in the North, unfortunately has not included Black South African intellectuals. So, and that this unevenness of the exchange, where indeed our students refer to first, second, third wave feminism as though it were an African phenomenon, and the citations of their own ancestry. In other words, when they are outlining the lineage that they their own scholarship is drawing on, that lineage is a US lineage, or at most a Caribbean or Black British lineage. So it is not even an awareness that there's an absence of African thinking, and in the case of South African students, of South African thinking. So I think surfacing is definitely an intervention in the normalization of that absence. And I think the fact of Grace Musila's work and the work of other scholars is so necessary and vital, and that the African scholars like you and me, Akin, who are based in the North, also have a great responsibility. And I know that you already do this, and the ALA does this, but to ensure that the knowledge production process in the North, which has such power, tries to redistribute the unevenness that currently marks the way that the global North works, because it has an impact on the global South. My colleagues in South African universities are encouraged by the very South African mechanism to assess their promotions and to assess their tenuring process. They are encouraged to publish in Northern journals, which often are behind paywalls, which means that the very scholars who are creating the work are unable to read the work. Those of us in the global North, how are we acknowledging the value and the power of work published on the African continent? I think my book regarding Muslims, which is the Wits publication, was the first Africa published book that allowed somebody to earn tenure. And so for that, a tenure at Penn State. For that, I really pay tribute to my colleagues who helped me make that case. But it should not be a singular matter. The exchange between Africa and particularly the United States, which has such strong historical links, should not be, as we said in the introduction, an uncannily unequal one. You know, the connections are there, but all in one direction. That is unsustainable, and especially for those of us who travel between the continent and North America, and those of us who are based in North America who are African, have a real responsibility to ensure that that situation no longer obtains.
Thank you. This is very helpful and very sobering. When I first heard about the book, I actually went to University of Wits books press website to see if I could buy a copy from there. And it was actually quite difficult. So I actually got a South African friend to get a copy for me. And by and by, I realized that it was coming out because I was quite I didn't know what it was about. I read up on it, I read the blog, and it was very exciting. So I thought I would really get to read it. And by and by, the edition through NYU came out. And so I'm actually in a position of having 2 copies of the book. They are actually across from my, I'm doing it from my office. So, but in any case, I just want to say what a real thrill it is to know that it was actually published in South Africa first. I mean, again, of course, there's also the internal unevenness or unequal exchange, even within African countries. I mean, the fact that it could be published in South Africa by Wits University Press, it's not usually the kind of argument that you can make for the University of Ghana or University of Cheikh-Anta Diop University, for instance, if the press had such a book. So there are these levels of internal differences and unequal exchange. But I think it's actually very significant that this has had the impact within South Africa, and it's also accessible in these other side of the intellectual device, so to speak. So that makes me want to ask a final question of you, if you don't mind. I know I've sort of asked several, and it wasn't my intention, but actually quite fascinating, and I appreciate your responsiveness, which is to say, how has it done? What has been the reception or attention, or some kind of, what kind of attention has it gotten, and what can you surmise or project from those responses that the book has had in the last, since April, right? It came out in South Africa in April. I think it came out maybe around February this year in NYU, but sometimes earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Desiree?
You know, that's a really interesting question, because I think it's had such diverse responses. On one hand, obviously, there's been a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, and just people, readers being overjoyed and excited about the fact that here is a collection of Black feminist essays, and it is not a source that is going to be used for other people to prove their interpretive power. These are, you know, sources of knowledge making by Black women. What Gabeba has noted before has also been an important issue, the sense of distress about exclusion and why is X or Y not included. And that's got a lot to do with the fact that there has been such a huge gap. There's been a dearth, there's been a neglect among publishers to pay attention to a very long tradition of Black women's knowledge making, as opposed to, of course, fiction and autobiography, which falls into another category and which is received in a different way. So it varies such a lot. I think that one thing that this is why we decided to shape this talk in this way. Very often the perception is that this is going to be yet another text which is going to sort of reinforce and talk about power dynamics that I think so many people are familiar with along the lines of race and gender. But the point that we were trying to make today about the fact that Black feminist thought is often rich in a range of ideas, epistemologically rich, philosophically rich, in encouraging us to open up and think about different ways of being. This is something that I think has been sadly neglected. And it's something that's sadly neglected, not only in relation to this anthology, but I think in relation to many others as well. And I'll pause there.
And I will say that it's been a delight to know that it's being read. Akin, hearing your thoughtful questions is truly something I treasure, because this is, a reader, who has really attended to the quality of the writing as well as the ideas. And that happening has been so affirming to me. And we've also been fortunate to receive critical attention in the form of roundtables and reviews. And some of these reviews have also been critical. And of course, that is also part of a healthy and positive response. And the criticism has sometimes also followed the idea, why has it not done more? And I think that, as Desiree has already said, that this idea that we have to fulfill every expectation is a somewhat familiar one, and we cannot, and in fact we refuse to assert that this is going to meet that great absence, that that hunger that has followed the absence of attention to Black feminist knowledge making. but we hope that it will spur more. You know, this audience is now, this audience which has been so overjoyed is going to be hungry for more. And the critics who have written about it are going to want to write about more. So I hope that publishers, especially on the continent, will feel encouraged, and that scholars all over will engage and will rethink the politics of this knowledge exchange that I think is really not in a satisfactory state at the moment.
All right, well, thank you so much. And I mean, this is very, very helpful and actually very sobering. Again, I'll use that word, sobering in the sense of actually making one think and reflect, and knowing that there are a lot of work to be done, and that you actually essentially picked up one such gauntlet and have run a good race with it. So thank you very much. Publishers, of course, even the most compassionate ones are businesses, and they tend to, of course, think in those terms. But I think it's also a question of people, writers, scholars, editors being invested enough to actually push certain ideas, because until things are actually out there, we won't know what will make it or what will flow and what wouldn't. So again, thank you for taking this challenge and bringing this worth of experiences to the attention of the world beyond South Africa. So thank you, appreciate that. And think that, again, I mean, being that you're recovering, Gabeba, this is quite kind and generous of you to spend your last hour and a half with us. We appreciate your time, and thank you very much for the time. And to Desiree too, who hear back from us, both virtually here in terms of actually making these events available to those who may not have had an opportunity to listen to it as it developed live, but also in terms of ongoing conversation around similar topics before the end of this academic year. So thank you very much, and I wish you good recovery, quick recovery, and good will for the rest of the weekend. So thank you. And to our audience, both who are here and those who will see this event later, thank you for your attention. And this time next month, slightly actually, maybe early in December, because we often have been America-based, work with the calendar, and it's always Thanksgiving in the last week of November. So we tend to put the November event to early December, and that's where you hear from us. Hope to see you then. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.